Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around the world. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Blackjack, and today I got a special one for you. I was inspired by all of the dragon approach decks that I saw when they were popping up, when they were gaining steam, garnering popularity. I wanted to build one myself, but I wanted to do it in a new and an interesting way. So today, for you, I have Davros, the Dalek creator. So this guy is, let's see if I can get it in all of its glory. A colorless, a blue, a black, and a red for a 3/4 menace. And he reads, at the beginning of your end step, create a 3/3 black Dalek artifact creature token with menace if an opponent has lost 3 or more life this turn. Then each opponent who has lost 3 or more life this turn faces a villainous choice. You draw a card, or that player discards a card. So, I thought it would be cool to use this commander and then cast Dragon's Approach in order to make all 3 of my opponents face a villainous choice on all of my end steps instead of just 1 or 2 opponents. So this was kind of the 2 card combination that gave rise to this deck idea, and I'm very excited to show it to you. So let's get you turned down and let's get going. So as I said, this deck is Davros, the Dalek creator. So what's really interesting and what's cool about this deck is, again, if you don't know what Dragon's Approach does, it's 2 colorless and a red. It deals 3 damage to each opponent, and then I may exile Dragon's Approach and 4 other cards named Dragon's Approach from my graveyard. If I do, search my library for a dragon creature, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle. You'll notice the most important part at the bottom here. A deck can have any number of cards named Dragon's Approach. So this is one of few cards in the game that breaks the rules of Commander, where you can normally only play 1 of everything except for basic lands. There are a handful of these in the format. I chose this one to build a deck around because I think this one is one of the most interesting, and it's also one that leads to the most different designs through decks that I've seen. Uh, a example of one that I don't really like would be Shadowborn Apostles, where it feels like every deck is the exact same. This you can build in a variety of ways. In fact, this is the only Davros Dragon's Approach deck that I've seen, and I'm super proud of how it turned out. So again, the idea is we play a total of 25 Dragon's Approaches. It is the main aspect of the deck. It is the main win condition, is casting this. Ideally, you're ramping out to Davros as fast as possible, and then you're casting a Dragon's Approach every turn for the rest of the game, so that way you deal 3 to all your opponents, you go to your end step, trigger your commander, you make a 3/3 Dalek with Menace, and then all 3 of your opponents have to face a villainous choice. Either you get to draw, or they have to discard. So, that's 1/4 of the deck already finished. Let's go through the creatures. So, surprisingly, there's not a ton of payoff creatures that we're getting. There's 3 dragons total that you can get with Dragon's Approach. Ideally, you're looking to do it maybe once a game, and if you do it more than once, you're already in a winning position, so you don't need more than that. But these are the 3 that I chose. So first is Nullspine Dragon. It's 7 mana, which obviously isn't relevant because we'll be getting it with our Dragon's Approach. But it reads, When it enters the battlefield, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. So if we hypothetically cast 2 Dragon's Approaches and then exile all of them and play this, at worst, we're discarding our hand and then drawing 6 new cards because of the 6 damage we dealt to a target opponent. So more often than not, this is a basically build a new hand. Almost any time that you get this out with your Dragon's Approaches, you're doing it to put at least, I would say, 9 to 12 cards in your hand at minimum. Another option, if the board is really gummed up and we need to deal with whatever's happening, you can tutor up Balefire Dragon. That way, when he deals combat damage to a player, it deals 6 damage, well, I should say that much damage to each creature that player controls, which happens to be a 6/6, which is Balefire Dragon. So it is essentially a board wipe on a stick, and if the board's super gummed up and there's no board wipes in your hand, this is an option to get if we have to deal with what's out there. Finally, our third option from Magic Foundation's Niv-Mizzet Visionary, one of the many Niv-Mizzets that you can choose from. I chose this one because I love its effect, 1, and 2, I think it's a great way to garner card advantage. So it reads, you have no maximum hand size. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you draw that many cards. So, if this is out and you cast a Dragon's Approach, you're dealing a total of 9 damage to your opponents. That's non-combat. So you'll actually draw 9 cards from every singular Dragon's Approach that you play. This is the option you go for when the field is clear. You don't need a new hand right away, and you can build advantage over time. This is definitely your guy. A few other interesting creatures. We do have some mana reducers. Just to make Dragon's Approach a bit cheaper, you have Goblin Electromancer, Nightscape Familiar, and Ral Moonstone Mage. There are times where you flip this, but more often than not, just like the other two, this is just a way to make your Dragon's Approaches only cost 2 mana. Chandra's Incinerator is a sweet one. So it costs X less to cast, where X is the total damage, non-combat damage, that's dealt to your opponents this turn. So again, if you cast 1 Dragon's Approach, you've dealt a total of 9 non-combat damage this turn, which means Chandra's Incinerator will only cost 1 red mana. And then it says, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls. So this turns each individual Dragon's Approach into 3 lightning bolts that you can throw per player. So you get 1 lightning bolt per player, essentially, to throw anywhere you want at any of their creatures or any of their planeswalkers as a form of removal. Super underrated. We have Satyr Fire Dancer. It says, whenever an instant or sorcery you control deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to a creature that player controls. Same thing. Turns our Dragon's Approaches into individual lightning bolts for each of our opponents. Stormkiln Artist, just a way to make treasures. So whenever we cast a Dragon's Approach, we get to basically make a treasure. Last but not least is Sig River Cutthroat. So at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent has lost 3 or more life this turn, you may draw a card. This is going to trigger more than likely at the end of all of our end steps because of Dragon's Approach, and if we get lucky enough and people are attacking each other, we can also get some value from that. Next, we'll talk about sorceries. So this is not a Doctor Who themed deck. To be honest, I didn't even know Davros was from the Doctor Who universe. I've never watched it. He was more of a choice because I wanted Grixis colors, and it was an interesting way to trigger and utilize Dragon's Approach damage. That being said, there are some cool synergies like this. Exterminate, so we can replicate it by tapping an untapped Dalek we control to destroy a creature, and its controller loses 3 life. Not only can we have our opponents face a villainous choice from this effect, but the more Daleks we have based on our commander, the more people we can target. Jeska's Will, super powerful, doesn't need any introduction. In any red deck, if you own one and your playgroup is okay with you having this power level of a card, it's super good to have. Vandal Blast, catch-all artifact removal. Crux of Fate, so this is one of the few board wipes we play in the deck. The reason that I chose this one is the very, very small marginal amount of times that I've been able to utilize my Dragon's Approaches. I've been able to get out a dragon like the Niv Mizzet, and then I can still play a board wipe if the board's gummed up with this, and destroy all non-dragons to be able to actually keep my Niv Mizzet around. Feed the Swarm, just a bit of removal. And then delete, so it deals X damage to each non-artifact creature in each player. Another board wipe that dodges our Davros as well as the Daleks we make. Finally, Decree of Pain, just a big old board wipe that also draws cards, and we can cycle it earlier in the game to get rid of little creatures if we have to. We are only playing one instant in the whole deck, and it is just Invert Polarity. So this kind of breaks the rules of typical blue commander decks where I like to fit a counterspell into each one. This is the fun version of a counterspell. So when an opponent casts a spell and you target it with this, you flip a coin. If you win the flip, you take control of the spell. If you lose the flip, you counter the spell. So it's a win-win for you no matter what happens, but the off chance that you win the flip and get to take control of a crazy spell in the mid to late game was very hard for me to pass up, so I chose to play this over a traditional counterspell. So we can look at the artifacts, mostly just a big ramp package. Let's see here, we've got 4 pieces, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Like I've talked about many times when it comes to deck building, I like to have at least 10 pieces of ramp. So these are your usual suspects. Obviously your Soul Ring, your Arcane Signet, your Felwar Stone, but in addition to that we are playing, I think, all of the Signets, as well as all of the Talismans and the Thought Vessel to round out our 10. We also have Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, just as a couple forms of protection for our big dragons, our Davros. It's really important that this guy is out on the field and he's protected at all stages of the game. We are never going to win if this guy does not survive. In order for us to continue drawing our Dragon's Approaches, we need to be making our opponents face a villainous choice at every single one of our end steps, and we need to make sure all 3 of our opponents are doing it. You're going to see that there's cards in the enchantment section that punish our opponent for discarding cards or not having many cards in hand. So we can kind of make that villainous choice a little bit easier for them and have them give us a card instead of them discarding, because they're going to need that card to discard for other effects. We have Locket of Yesterdays, probably an interesting one that most Commander players have never seen. Spells you play cost 1 less to play for each card with the same name as that spell in your graveyard. So if you have 2 Dragon's Approaches in your graveyard, that means that all your future Dragon's Approaches are 2 mana less. Obviously, once you get to the point where you have 5 and you're exiling them to get your dragon, you really don't care about the cost reduction anymore. but on the way there, this makes it really, really cheap. And then finally, Thrumming Stone. If you've seen one of these decks before that breaks the commander rule of having one card, you know how dangerous this is. It gives your spells Ripple 4. So what that means is if I cast a Dragon's Approach, I trigger Thrumming Stone. So when I cast that spell, I reveal the top 4 cards in my library, and if I find a spell with the same name, I can cast it and then continue going. So I look at every 4 cards, and if I hit another Dragon's Approach, I get to cast that, I get to trigger Thrumming Stone, and I get to go again and again and again. That's part of the reason we're playing 25 total, so that way on average, this will go through the entire deck of Dragon's Approaches. Obviously, that's not going to happen every time, but it would be awesome. I've never had it happen, but I would love to cast a Dragon's Approach and have it go through my library and cast another 24 Dragon's Approaches. Forget about the dragon, you're just going to kill them with 25 lightning bolts. Next is the enchantment section. So as we talked about, making your opponent pay or face a villainous choice, we want to play cards that kind of punish them for making these choices. So we have Painful Quandary. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, they lose 5 life unless they discard a card. So it incentivizes our opponents to keep cards in their hand and therefore give us card draw with Davros. Whoops. We have Court of Ambition. So this introduces the monarchy, and then at the beginning of my upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card. If I'm the monarch, they basically do that twice, so they lose 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. Another way of limiting the resources and options that our opponents have, so that way, more often than not, they're choosing to give us the card with Davros, which is the goal. Last but not least, Blood Chief Ascension. So this reads, at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on Blood Chief Ascension. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if this has 3 or more quest counters on it, you may have that player lose 2 life. If you do, you gain 2 life. Another example of mid to late game, if this is out with the quest counters needed to be active, they don't really want to be discarding anymore because not only are they losing a card from their hand, they're also going to start to take damage and I'm going to start to gain life. So hopefully it kind of eases them into giving us cards with Davros. We have a couple of card advantage enchantment engines. So in a lot of my black decks, I love to play Phyrexian Arena, Black Market Connections. Phyrexian Arena is obviously just lose 1, draw 1 extra on all of our turns. Black Market Connections can do a whole bevy of things just based on how much life you want to pay. You can make a treasure, you can make a guy, you can draw an extra card. More often than not, I'll usually make a treasure and I'll usually draw a card. I'm not really worried about the shapeshifter, but I could just do it if I needed to. Finally, as we talked about before, I have 37 lands. So if you've watched my other deck techs, most of my 3-color decks, I always play 3 of each basic. So I'm usually playing 9 basics in most of my 3-color decks. And then, just as always, this is not, you must build it this way. This is just the lands that I had. So I'll just kind of go through it. And as I'm doing that, I'll talk to you a little bit more about Davros. I was very, very impressed the first few times I played with this deck. I didn't know what to expect. As I said, I'd never seen a Davros Dragon's Approach deck before. But it's a lot more punishing than it looks. I would say more often than not with my ramp, I am getting Davros down on turn 3 most games. And then from there on out, I am casting a Dragon's Approach and I'm making my opponents face a villainous choice for the rest of the game on each of my turns. Even if, because more often than not, they're not going to want to give you the card. So in the beginning, your opponents are probably going to choose to discard, but I would say by the second or third Dragon's Approach, at least one opponent is going to have a small amount of cards in their hand or a small amount of options, and they're going to have to start giving you the card draw, and that's when this deck really starts to churn and burn, is if you're getting 1 to 2 people facing a villainous choice and giving you that card draw instead, it's very easy to start building up advantage. Another cool thing about Davros is since he has Menace, he's able to trigger himself on one opponent. So even if I don't have any Dragon's Approaches, just having Davros out and attacking an opponent with him, since he has Menace, he's hard to block. I still get through for 3 damage and I still make that opponent face a villainous choice. And then it also makes a 3/3 Dalek with Menace that can the next turn attack a different opponent. So you can still start to make that work and make people face villainous choices, even if your Dragon's Approach package is just not working that game. But that's it. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. I hope I gave you some ideas, and if you're interested, again, I highly recommend Dragon's Approach. I think it's a super cool and interesting way to build a commander deck. So, as always, Godspeed.